executive, sorry, I'm Gayatri Srinivasan. I'm the executive director for the Office of Corporate Relations. And I am happy to present to you the Bench to Market talks. This is the third year of our running these talk series, and we are excited to present to you Dr. Bhatti. But before that, I would like to give you a little bit of insight into what's coming and who we are. The Bench to Market talks is a collaboration between Biolocity, Georgia Clinical and Translational Science Alliance, and the Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Biosciences at Georgia Tech. We put together about 11 talks, one per month approximately. And Christina, if you can move the slides to the next one. The next talk is on December 9th. We are talking about preparing high quality invention disclosures. The next one is January on IP strategies. February 17th, we are talking about FDA strategies. March 17th, we're going to be talking about quality management systems that startups in the life sciences need to think about. April 7th, we'll be talking about licensing versus starting your own company. May 12th, we are going to be talking about investment and dilution. And then June 2nd, we're going to wrap up with MedTech funder perspective. With that, I would love to also give you the next slide talks about BARDA drive funding partnership opportunities. This is in areas of interest that are surrounding early notification to act, control and treat, solving sepsis, remote patient monitoring and remote diagnostic tools, redirect, which is repurposing drugs in response to chemical threats, and beyond the needle, which is alternative routes to administer vaccines. And the next slide. We are showcasing preparing high quality invention disclosures. Nicole Morris from Emory's law school will be presenting. And she is part of the Tiger program. For those who are not aware, you can ask her about it and she'll probably talk about the Tiger programming as well. With that, I would like to kick off today's talk, which is going to be by Dr. Pamela Bhatti. She is going to be talking about her journey, and the title is An Accidental Entrepreneur from Assistant Professor to Chief Operating Officer. Dr. Bhatti is an Associate Professor and Associate Chair for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering in Georgia Tech. Her research is dedicated to overcoming sensory loss in human hearing through focused neural stimulation and novel implantable sensors. Dr. Bhatti also conducts research in cardiac imaging to assess and monitor cardiovascular disease. Today, she will focus on her journey in entrepreneurship. With that, I would like to stop sharing and transfer the honor to Dr. Bhatti to present her journey.
Thank you very much, Gayatri. That was a warm welcome and a wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen of my talk. And as I'm coming up to speed with that, I just want to say that I won't be talking about my research at all. I'd love to talk to you about that body of research in neural engineering and cardiac monitoring another time. And today I'm going to talk about my journey as being an entrepreneur. And I think it was fantastic, the list of talks and opportunities that Gayatri went through, because there's so much to be learned. And as you'll see in this talk, I'm going to touch upon all those topics that will be coming up. So I hope it's of value to you. As a disclosure, I am a co-founder of Camarad Technologies, and I am the Chief Operating Officer. So I want to put that out there. And I wanted to begin with a story. And to hopefully set the stage for why this is compelling and important to me. And as I proceed, Gayatri, I want to ask you to watch the chat, and if there's any time where I need to stop and address a question, please feel free to interrupt me. So let's get back to a story. Um, so somewhere today, two women have gone in for a routine mammogram. Let's call one Rhonda and let's call one Beth. So they go into their clinical care center. They have a routine mammogram. One comes up clean and the other comes up concerning. And so one woman is going to have to go back in to have a follow up. But it turns out that their cases were mixed. Their imaging studies were mixed up. And so as a result, the person, Rhonda, has been given a clean bill of health, but she actually does have a carcinoma. Whereas Anne is worried, but she's actually safe. And so this should never happen. It's called a wrong patient error, and it's a never event. This should never happen. And it rarely happens, but it should never happen. Not only is it costly, but the cost of, defending these errors in the clinical setting is enormous. And so the kind of the work that we do, the baseline of our technology here is you may have a right diagnosis, but when you mix up a patient's imaging study, this is a dramatic error. And we have a tool that can verify the patient. And basically, it's very simple. We can take a picture of a patient when they come in for an imaging study and assign that in their case. And so, um, as we tell this story, the occurrences, if we think about, what can cause harm, what can cause death, heart disease is the number one cause of death, and that's why I do research in cardiac monitoring. Cancer is the number two cause of death. So these are dramatic. But I didn't know about this until I started this work, is that medical errors and a patient misidentification error is one type of medical error. That's 11% in terms of death. And if you take a step back, medical error is something that we can control. It is difficult to control heart disease. It is very difficult to control cancer. But errors are something that we can control. And if you think about it, that's 100 to 3,000, 100,000 to 3,000 deaths per year that are preventable. And these numbers are actually very hard to get to because nobody wants to talk about errors that we do that cause death. So in one state, in just 1 year, in the state of Pennsylvania, they found 196 events that were related in radiology. And so on one hand, we can think about this as harm to the patient, but then we can also think about this as costs within the system. And defending these errors, defending these things that should never happen are very costly to a medical system. And so medical malpractice costs are high, and they're ever increasing. I mean, you can even just Google on during this talk about a case where one person's kidney was removed because they had the wrong patient. So for me, getting back to, this talk is, an accidental entrepreneur. Well, okay, I understand the problem. I see the potential impact, but I am an academic. And as I stated in the beginning, this work really has nothing to do with my research. It turns out that a colleague asked me to help them join in this research, right? My world is this timeline. This is a timeline of the promotion process at Georgia Tech. So when you come in as an assistant professor, or I can give this case because it's closest to me, is that you're really focused on tenure. What is it going to get what is it going to take to get tenure? And nowhere in the tenure package do you get to check off a box where it says entrepreneur, started a company. I mean, that's not how we're rated. I would say that I find value in it, but The typical standard tenure process does not involve being an entrepreneur. Okay, so how did I get involved? Why would I want to do this? And this is a picture of a portable X-ray system, and I'll put an arrow here. This is really our system. It takes a picture of a patient when they come in a high throughput setting. So an example of that is the intensive care unit, and patients have X-rays taken often, which is not great, but they have them taken often. And so they compare a current X-ray with a prior X-ray. So if they have the wrong prior X-ray, you're mixing up a patient. So what we do is during the imaging study, a patient X-ray is taken. We take their physical image, a picture of the patient, and we insert that into their file. Um, it seems pretty straightforward, pretty easy. So from an engineering point of view, it was very easy to put the system together. And I got involved. This company was co-founded with my husband, and I tried to stay away as much as possible because generally you don't want to start a company with someone very close to you. But I found it so simple, so elegant to build a solution that we immediately built it and started to try it out. And I want to say that it's pretty important when you think about an idea to think about how do you protect your IP. You want to put kind of your stake in the ground that your team thought this up. And so that's why I focus on that. How do I say this? Having your IP protected doesn't necessarily um, put you as a front runner for starting a company. However, it makes you much more attractive to investors. And so this is a very simple idea, and we can integrate this patient image along with their imaging file in at a PACS workstation. So this is a point of care insertion, and that forever goes with the patient. So if there's any concern, is this patient the right patient? A radiologist quickly looks down and says, well, this is the right patient. So let me talk a little bit about, when we first started this work, most people said, well, yeah, I mean, there's RFID technology. Come on, patients don't get mixed up in the hospital. And I only started this because the radiologist, my husband, said, we saw a wrong patient error today. And we fixed it in the system. I called up to the floor, I talked to the nurse, and he, went and found out, and he realized there's a patient misidentification error. So they were looking at the x ray and thinking this isn't the right patient. And he thought about it, and he said, well, he was an engineer by training before radiology. He said, why don't we just take their picture? It would be so simple just to have that point of information. And he also brought up something called patient empathy. And I thought that was kind of odd. I said, well, you're a doctor, you work with patients. How could you not have empathy? And he said, no, I have empathy, but I actually don't get to see my patients. I'm a radiologist. I sit in a dark room. So if any of you are suffering from Zoom fatigue, which I must say I get some of it some days, sitting in a room all by myself, staring at a monitor, he said, well, that's our world. We don't see the patient. And I would like to see my patients. And this is one quick way. Now, you can't really launch a company saying you're delivering empathy or you're enabling empathy, but it's those secondary pieces that get people attracted to the company. Because that's one reason why I thought this was a really important thing to do, in addition to preventing errors that we can control. So, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about the technology as to how I continue to get pretty excited to work with it. So, our first point of entry was at Emory University, and this is what radiologists look at all day long. So they compare a new image with the prior image. So when my colleague, my husband said, "Oh, these aren't the same patient," I'd say, "Well, I don't know. I see some hardware inside the patient that might tip it off." And then he said, "Well, look at this. On the left-hand side, you have an African American male. On the right-hand side, you have a Caucasian male." I said, "Okay, now I can see the difference." And he said, that is a lot quicker for me to look at those images than to try to figure out what's inside the patient. I said, all right, but what do your colleagues think? And so when we had this in the system, we found that it was very helpful to the radiology technicians because this is not to place blame, but where the error occurs is when a radiology technician takes a new image and doesn't clear the patient's information, but appends the new image in. And so this enables a radiology technician, A, to quickly identify the patient, and B, if by chance there is a mix up, they can go back in and assign the right patient to the right image. And why that is important is you don't want to throw away an image that you've taken of a person because taking a new image exposes them to more radiation, and that's not really a good idea. And so here's another picture um, of an image of a patient's foot in this case. And you know, I want to talk a little bit about this, but not go into too much detail because I'm not a radiologist. But they're finding now that we're taking images, there's more information. Not only does this identify the patient, but there is clinical information that we can use. And I wanted to pause here and talk about that for a second, because when you start a company or you start a project and you find that we're learning more by having this tool in place than we envisioned, and that's pretty exciting. And another piece of information I wanted to add is that when we first started this project in 2010, people asked us, why are you thinking it's okay to take a picture of a person, even though the moment a person comes into a hospital it is okay? um, we've changed now. Our society has changed where we're fairly comfortable taking pictures of people and seeing pictures of people. But this was a concern, and we also are very mindful and thoughtful as to what we do with that patient's image. And then lastly, I wanted to touch upon the piece about empathy. So this is a little clip from Dr. Baumgarten, and she said, I'm so used to not seeing a patient's image. And now I see the patient and I actually feel closer to the patient and I can associate with the patient and I feel a greater sense of satisfaction with the work that I do as a radiologist. And so we can go into the dollars and cents of how much this is going to cost, but quite honestly, I stick around much more for the empathy point of view. So, where did this lead me? I say how I, wanted to kind of stay away from starting a company with my husband, who's a radiologist. But what makes it pretty exciting is when you start to bring other team members on, and we have a Georgia Tech grad who is the chief technical officer. And so right now we're a team of three, and we're expanding the company as rapidly as we can in this era of, you know having to run fast but walk slow because of COVID-19. But let me talk a little bit more about, what did it take? Why should anybody do this given what I've said about being an academic entrepreneur? We started it in 2010 and now it's 2020. So what are some of the steps that one can take? Well, the first is, and I'm probably going to go a little too quickly through this talk just because I can't see you to pause, but I hope to leave time for questions. And the first thing is, write down your ideas. Don't be afraid. And the next session we're going to have is how to write a good disclosure. Is submit a disclosure. Submit many disclosures. Um, it's not natural for an academic to stop and train their students on how to write a disclosure and write disclosures. But this really is, one, it sets a time point for your idea. And two, you really want the office you want the tech transfer office, the technology licensing office, you want them to know who you are. You want them to see you as an inventor and an innovator. That being said, being in an academic setting, whether it be clinical or someplace like Georgia Tech, is that there are conflicts of interest. And how those arise are you're being funded. And it turns out that this wasn't my research, so I didn't have to be concerned about having students on it, but we have funders and we work at an institution where we do um, give away our rights for our IP. And we also need to make sure that if we're focusing on training a student, that we're not putting them in an awkward position of having them work more for work towards the company goals versus the trainee goals. And so my first priority is always as an academic, and so I'm very careful about my conflicts and managing those well. So another kind of new thing for many of us is intellectual property, right? If this was what you wanted to focus upon, you wouldn't have picked this career. You might have gone into law, you might have gone into business. So now we're faced with training up, and a lot of that is learning the language. There are many words that I don't know the definition to, and a lot of times I takes me a while to figure out the definition to those words. And I this is a great book written by my colleague Michelle Marcolongo, who's now the dean of engineering at Villanova. And it's a really easy read. You can just read this in less than a weekend to give you a baseline knowledge or a baseline vocabulary that you can continue to build upon. Also, you want to know what the IP policy is at your institution, and it's at Georgia Tech, it's handled differently for undergraduate students versus graduate students and employees. And really, the differentiator is who is paying you. If you're being paid by Georgia Tech, you need to assign your IP to them. If you are not paid, then you have more freedom, but you also have the burden of protecting and pursuing your IP. So I encourage you to look that up. My IP is shared between Emory and Georgia Tech, and the bulk of it is at Emory. So I follow both guidelines in terms of IP. Now, as you're thinking about, you have an idea and you think it has some legs, you filed a disclosure, and how do you fund that? We are calibrated and trained for certain types of funding. It can be R01 funding, especially in the clinical setting. We need to get that R01 to get tenure, actually multiple R01s. But think about alternate funding. How can you support this work? And the GRA Alliance that's associated with the Georgia CTA is a great way to start. Seek out a grant. Usually one grant leads to another. So far our company is built on non-dilutive funding. And so that means that no one's asking for a piece of the pie. And they are more than happy to support good ideas. So through this mechanism, you can work through it SBIR. You can also go for some translational work through the National Science Foundation. There's Partnership for Innovation, and there's also the National Science Foundation I-Corps program. It's not necessarily going to fund your work as much as fund you in understanding how to proceed in knowing if your technology may have value. And that leads me to learn how to do customer and stakeholder discovery. It's really easy for me to just flip through these slides and tell you what to do, but it's actually pretty hard to do. And that's what the National Science Foundation as well as NIH I-Corps program funds. And so the idea is you talk to many customers around the country. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we proceeded. We said, do you care about errors? Which, if you have done customer discovery, this is probably a stupid question. Who's going to say we don't care about errors? Everybody, in some way, will care about errors. Now, do you see errors in your practice? That's a pretty loaded question. I'm not sure if a clinician would want to say, yes, I see errors in my practice. So we learned how to ask the right questions to get to the right answers about, does this technology have value in the clinical setting? We moved further, meaning that we moved from talking to practitioners to people who are concerned with quality. And the next question is, what will you pay for reducing errors? And this becomes a little more interesting because there are kind of built-in costs for running a clinic, and there are some costs that need to be attributed to maintaining quality. So then we were able to drill down, well, what will you pay for? What is of value to you? And that's pretty important. One is understanding, or one is developing an idea that you think has merit. But equally, and I would want to say more important, is who is going to value that idea and who is going to be able to promote and pay. And that's why I would strongly encourage you to seek out any resources, and there's multiple, and I'm happy to talk about that more, how to do customer discovery. And it's much more about the customer or the stakeholder than the idea. Because quite honestly, you're in a system where you probably can develop the idea fairly rapidly, but knowing who's going to adopt the idea is pretty important. And another really important component that I think is hard, learn to pivot. And if you have a grant for funding to do research, I don't think your funders want to hear about pivoting because they funded you to take something across the finish line. Learning to pivot means taking your idea and well, I think there's more than A, B, and C, but I'll start with A is, does anybody want this? It could be a great idea. You could have 10 years of National Science Foundation funding for this idea. But if it's not going to be adopted by the stakeholders, it may not be the right time to push that idea forward, or learn to see if that idea or that invention has value in another setting. So sometimes that's pretty hard, or you just don't have the bandwidth. So sometimes you have to table your ideas or pick another idea to work on. So another thing that customer discovery teaches you is that it's great. I mean, we're all about success, right? We love to talk about things, but it's really important to think about, why did something fail? Failure could not mean that it doesn't work. It could also mean that it's not the right time. And I see a message in the chat, and I do want to address that. Uh, okay, I think it's not for me. So I'll continue with the discussion. Um, and I was talking about failure and timing. And we found that when we first started this project in 2010, the timing was a little off. And part of it is people felt uncomfortable seeing a patient's photograph. And we also found that as we moved into the clinical setting, the technicians did not like having a camera. We found that the camera was actually getting turned off in by the nighttime technicians, and only until they found, well, we actually found, we made it so you can't turn off the camera because it was put in there from the quality officer. But when they learned that it actually helped them fix a mistake, and it wasn't a mistake, fix an oversight, they changed from feeling that it was big brother to, hey, this tool has your back. And so that's why I want to talk about customer discovery and timing. So customer discovery teaches you things for that slice in time, and pivoting teaches you that, hey, you might need to adapt or adjust or wait, and see when this is a better introduction, when people are more comfortable with having this in this setting. Um, and this leads me to say, you need to be a bit pig-headed. Um, if you think about discoveries, here's a picture of, you know, a device that we look at, you know, would we have adopted it during that time? Maybe the people who are early adopters who love the greatest technology. I'm not one of those people. I only change my iPhone when I'm forced to. But what we use now is not necessarily something that we thought we needed. And this is where it gets kind of dicey, meaning that you need to be a bit pig-headed with your idea. When I was working on this in the earlier years, I guess the midpoint, I said, I don't see people saying they want our tool from our customer discovery. But the clinician said, "No, I think we need this tool." And I said, "Well, you're taking a risk because our customer discovery told us that nobody wants this in the way that you think they do." And he said, "No, I think they want it." And there's another quote from Henry Ford when he was introducing the gasoline engine, and he said, "If you ask people what they wanted at the turn of the century, they wanted faster horses. They would have not wanted a car." So that's when you need to be a bit pig-headed to push your ideas, but it's risky. It's very risky. Um, I also want to talk a little bit about. I'm not going to go into details of the business, but you do have to understand what it's going to take to introduce your product. There are people who will help you. You can go to seminars, you can learn, but our point of entry is retrofitting the market. So we're looking at existing X-ray technology. So the reason why this is important is because your path to introduction is hugely critical, because you can have a wonderful idea, but if it's a very long time frame before you can see how it's used in the clinical setting, that's going to set you back. So getting your ideas in the clinical setting and vetting them and using something called an MVP, a minimal viable product, is really important, because you can make all these business model projections and talk about your funding strategy, but until you can get your system, your device in the hands of users and stakeholders, you're not going to know enough. And everything is a projection and a speculation. So, coming back to who I am as an academic, I could not have envisioned myself when I was starting out that I would be writing, understanding a business model and projections. And what that comes from is building a strong team. So I'm going to transition into the talk about, what's different. We talk about being in a team, and I want to attribute the rest of these slides to a great colleague, Michelle Bennett at the NCI, who does give talks here through the CTSA about team science. And team science is undervalued. I mean, many of us build a lab, we're the lab PI, we're kind of used to that hierarchy, but it's really not the most ideal hierarchy, right? Everyone has strengths, and we need to build a team. And the company team not only pushed me from my comfort zone into my challenge zone, but it also put me in a bit of a panic zone. And part of how you overcome that is through building a strong team. And it's not like go to a buffet and pick out different team members. This comes through kind of a bit of angst and pain, and really understanding or being forced to understand team science. And this is a slide that gives you many different aspects of team science, but I highlight this because, we start here with a vision, right? We have someone, or it could be us, who's really excited about a product or an idea, and they bring us along and we get really excited about it. And all these other components are critically important. Setting expectations. So I told my co-founder that I am not willing to you know go 100% into a company right now, because it's really important to me to continue on with my students and research projects, and I want to make full professors, so I'm not going to jump into a 100% startup right now. And then there's always conflict, there's leadership, there's communication, and way here over on the right there's something called psychological safety, which it's a newer term, but it means that Are you comfortable sharing your ideas in a group? And for a company to thrive, or even a research group to thrive and be healthy, we need to be in a context where we can share our ideas, understand that they're not going to get stolen, um, build trust within our group. And I hover on trust for a bit because one of the one of the things that they say about a husband wife team co-founding a company is that, oh, something's going to implode. And it is pretty risky. In some ways I thought it was really efficient that, at home we could do company work. But as we have brought more members on the team, I'm very focused on trust because I don't want the person or people to feel like, oh, the husband and wife team, they're going to call all the shots and we're going to be left out. And one way to build trust is in how you divide up the company. You know, who has ownership? If it's always two main people as owners, and as people come on they don't have ownership, I don't think you're building trust when you kind of operate in this very exclusive environment. So I would embrace team science if you feel you want to start a company or have a play in entrepreneurship. Another piece of team science, and these are models when they were first shown to me, how does a team work? Well, you form a team and then you start to storm. I thought, okay, this is a nice little graphic, but I'm adverse to storming. I don't like conflict. But really, conflict has value because it takes you through a process and it helps you understand, well, where what is most important to you? Where do you see yourself having the most impact? And what are the personality types within your company? And here's a nice quote is that, you know, we needed to argue. So storming is something I've experienced, something I've observed, but if you're going to do something that you're passionate about, that you believe in, and that you want to bring people into the fold and have an impact, you're not all going to think alike. And I'm part of a leadership team for my unit. So I'm an associate chair in electrical computer engineering, and we make decisions as a unit. And we've made many decisions in the course of the pandemic that we didn't always feel comfortable about, but you have to go through a storming phase for any team, and it's normal, and I think it's appreciated. So how do you find your team norms? So after you finish storming, here's a time for you to, if you think about stirring the pot, how does that pot settle out? Do you have the same values? My values are not, quite honestly, to launch a company that makes a lot of money. My value is to launch something that has an impact, that people feel excited about, that's simple. I don't want to make really complicated technology. I want to put it in the hands of the user and in the hands of the clinic as soon as possible. And another piece is really being accountable for what you say you're going to do. So, although I said I'm not willing to jump full head into a company right now and stop being in an academic, I am accountable. The company isn't something that takes second class in terms of time. If I say I'm going to do something, follow through, and my team members can count on me. And so, the reason why I wanted to bring leadership and team building into this is because those are completely essential for a company and having a startup. There's no set leadership type. I know we have these archetypes of what's a good leader, what's a strong leader. I say think about what your values are. Think about what voice you want to have. Think about what impact you want to make. Leaders are not all the same. We don't need all the same kind of leaders. We need different kinds of leaders in a company. And there's not one single person who does everything and leads a company. So I think that this is really an opportunity to embrace creativity and to give yourself some freedom to think about, what do I want to be? What do I want to do? You might not want to start a company. You might not want to be a leader. And that's all fine. And I have two books here, and they're very different in how they approach leadership. Um, and I won't really go too far into them because I want you to enjoy them. But both of these books were recommended to me by people in leadership, and I read both of them, and I take from them what resonates to me, but it also helps me build an appreciation for different leadership types and how you can operate and contribute with your own authentic way. And let me return to some secondary benefits from entrepreneurship. While I did say that I am on, I'm a tenure track professor, and advancing along that track is very important to me. But teaching is incredibly important to me. And so I've always found a way to roll entrepreneurship, innovation into how I teach. And that has created a substrate for creating entrepreneurship within our master's program in electrical and computer engineering. That's a pivotal component. I'm very involved with the CreateX program. So if there are any undergrads and graduate students who want to learn more about how to launch your own company within a scaffolded environment at Georgia Tech, happy to talk. With respect to clinical and translational researchers, NCATS, that sponsors the CTSA, we have our own I-Corps program, and I'm one of the instructors. And lastly, I want to say that, being in innovation and entrepreneurship has put me front and center with this huge, broad initiative at the National Science Foundation and the Convergence Accelerator. So I coach, full-fledged, very senior professors, and how do you create value with your ideas, and at a very large scale. And lastly, I do need to give a plug as the training director for the Georgia CTSA translational research programs. These do allow some component of entrepreneurship. We teach it in the colloquium, but I want to say that if you are really excited about translating, but staying a little more on the academic side, on the clinical side, there are programs for both for graduate students, postdocs, junior faculty. Um, this is I can't say enough about what these opportunities bring in terms of learning how value is brought to a clinical setting. In my case, I really enjoy technology, and I learned how to do patient studies, epidemiology. Um, it really gave me a very broad view, and I fold that into everything that I do. So this is uh, kind of one of those, I guess cheesy isn't the right word, but I think it's kind of cheesy, right? It's one of these things that maybe a middle manager puts up in their office, but I think it really holds true. I mean, be creative, be persistent. And let me give you a template. This is something I took from IDEO. I work with IDEO on teaching entrepreneurship. And this is a slide which I think is pretty simple, and this will be in the recording. So if you need to take it or take a picture of it, is like, think about this. Our what is for whom, so that they can do what, you know, and which brings some value. And you don't have to think about starting a company, or think about IP, but think about, what it how can you use your creative energy to create value for people who you care about, for people who are interesting. This can be a product that you bring into a research setting. It can be a teaching innovation. um, I think there's so much, and so many places you can go. And that's why I call myself an accidental entrepreneur, because this isn't what I started out to do, but I think this is something that continues to bring value, enthusiasm, and some angst, because it is challenging to balance all these pieces. So at that point, I wanted to open up the floor. Let me stop screen sharing, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I enjoyed your presentation, and I'm going to reach out to you to ask for the books. I grabbed some names of the books, but I thought they were fascinating. And, you know, I'm not an entrepreneur, but I would love to read those books because I think it'll be helpful in my realm as well. But maybe I can kick off one question while others ruminate and think about questions to ask. Um, if if you were to do this all over again, what would you do differently?
I think number one, I wouldn't hesitate when people say, "Oh, you shouldn't start a company with such and such person," or, "Why work with your husband?" It's like if an idea is good, don't shy away. You know, because as you pursue it, it goes from being in your head to being real. And as it starts to be more and more real, you see the value, or you see, it's time to step off.
Sure. And you did mention that, your husband is also a co-founder of the company. And I had this thing like, two accidental entrepreneurs, right? I mean, in the sense that he's also an assistant, he's also a professor.
Mhm.
So how do you, and you have children. So how does all that navigate with your work? And you did talk about, from a company standpoint, but I'm talking about from a personal standpoint, how does that impact your everyday life?
So I think going through the I-Corps process where they really haze you a lot, um, it built some chops in me. Whereas, it's people are going to say a lot of things, and so you take it as it comes. You don't. It's not your idea is not you. You are going to have multiple ideas, and so I think one way was going through this process with my co-founder, who's a spouse, and he didn't mind getting hazed, and so I learned to kind of to build a thicker skin. And because this is something that is in the medical space, it moves slower. The expectations are less. um, they're not less, but if you're going to adopt something that touches a patient, you need to have validated it. So I have a longer fuse. It gives me a longer timeline so I can balance more. And I also touched upon I reap all the value that I can and just immediately put it into my academic life. So I teach entrepreneurship, which, you know, that's how I balance my teaching load. I think it is, quite honestly, really efficient to work with your spouse because you can handle, late nights. When somebody said, "Oh, why would you work with your spouse?" And this is a very personal note, I said, I really wouldn't want my husband working late at night with some other woman. So, I think so in some respect, it's easier because you get to be with someone who you really care about a lot. And I have the personality where I don't back down. I question a lot. So we're all equal. Our third, our chief technology officer, he's equal. We're all the same.
So that's wonderful. What during your journey, what was the biggest challenge that you encountered?
So there were two challenges. I think the first was when we were doing customer discovery and we would talk to people and they say, I don't make errors, so I don't need a tool that helps because they didn't make errors. So when you're introducing something that makes someone look bad, why would they want your tool? So I thought, I don't want to spend time doing this. But my colleague was very pig-headed about it. And I said, okay, I'm not going to put this as a priority, but sure. It's not all or nothing. So I learned to get away from all or nothing thinking. And I think another time that it is, and it still is critical, is when you think about that it may take longer to reach the promotion that you want, right? So there are people who, you know, things catalyze really well for them and they have like 2 R1s and they've got a lab full of, great thriving students and postdocs. And here I am like writing a business plan. I'm like, oh, well, is this the smartest thing to be doing? And what helps me through those points is, what impact do I want to have? Is it going to matter to me that I got to full professor 1 year sooner, or is it going to matter to me that I'm part of a team that put something in a clinic that prevented an error? And that gives me satisfaction.
Sure. No, that's very well said. I understand and I appreciate you bringing that. One thing that did pique my interest is this is a device, a medical device, but it's not really what you would think of your traditional device that in a medical device sense. So, from a regulatory pathway, what was nuanced or what was different for this particular thing to be accepted? Or was there no process from a regulatory standpoint?
So there is a process. We have not reached that is next on our plate. So we actually will probably work with GCMI, and I want to give a plug for GCMI just because it's so accessible, and it's such a great resource. So it's I can't answer that because I haven't gotten to it, but the cost will be considerable, in order to get through. I work on implantable devices in my research, so this is going to be easier, but so the some of the more critical parts are making sure that we protect patient information
Right,
because that's very important.
right. Um, in terms of customer discovery and refining the product market fit, how were you able to tweak the product based on what you heard?
So this is kind of a trick. So, um, so so just purely based on what we heard, we needed to make sure that it sat in the setting unnoticed, because people don't want to do an extra step and they shouldn't. The whole point is that this should be seamless and sit in the setting unnoticed. It just sits in the background. Um, the other thing that we learned from customer discovery is, while I was championing this empathy piece, some radiologists don't want to see the patient because it slows them down. They're like, I don't want to know that this is a person. I just want to speed through these images because that's going to make it harder for me. And so people can turn off the setting. They don't have to see the images. We can run in the background and just flag images that, hey, you probably should take a look at this one. So it really was tailoring it to the radiologist, and also um, knowing that we should not let the technicians be able to turn off the system. And so those were the pieces, but I think that's more in the clinical deployment than the customer discovery per se. But the discovery piece is, people don't want to do an extra step and they shouldn't have to.
Yeah,
Um, and also, it's different in different environments. And one thing we learned is that if you have buy-in from the top down, that's critically important. You have to have the chief quality officer saying, we need to put this in place because there's a hill to climb, and we need to steady people on that hill. And once they get used to it, they're pretty happy with it.
sure. I still don't see any questions, and I
It's
seem
okay.
to have one more question for you.
Sure.
My question is, how has you not seeking dilutive funding, like angels or venture capitalists, impacted the speed or direction of your company?
So that's a great question. When you have non-dilutive funding, you don't have a boss. And so that lets us pace it well for now. But we're really at an inflection point. It's not clear whether this is something that we should take angel funding. So when you have an angel investor, they're intimately involved and you must answer to them immediately. And so me being in me I'm at Georgia Tech, and we have we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So our students come first. And so I don't want to have to make those choices. But so our route is to deploy it up until we reach a critical mass where there's overwhelming information that this has value. At that point, we will have a better sense of whether we want to seek angel funding and jump on that or work with the manufacturers.
Well, I don't have any other questions, and I
Well,
still don't see
actually,
any.
there's one quick question that just popped up in the Q&A box, and they're asking about how ethical issues are managed. And the example given is, do patients sign consent forms to have their images taken?
Yeah, so that's actually a really important question. Um, you may not know this, but when you come into, so for example, if you walk into CHOA, there's a sign that says that your image is being taken the moment you walk in. When you come into Emory, when you sign up to get care at Emory, you are consenting to having your picture being taken. That being said, we went through a process where we did a study and we asked people, were they comfortable having their picture being taken? And it only sits in the clinical setting. And this was done about 3 years ago. And the patients were okay with having their image being taken. But this was something that was challenging in the beginning. I think part of it is that people don't know that it's routine to have your picture being taken when you come into a clinical setting. I don't know if there's a follow-up.
No, there isn't. I think that was a very important question because this is about patients and patient identity. So,
Mhm.
um, all right, I don't see any other questions. So, thank you so much, Pamela. I really appreciate what you had to tell us about your journey and this. Oh, I do see another question pop up. Oh, okay, thank you. But I'm
Sure.
hoping that, since it's recorded, this will be available for people to check out and watch at the time that is meaningful to them as well. Because I feel a lot of times we we listen to information and they may not be pertinent to that situation, but it'll be interesting. Oh, there is another question. Have you researched any password protection technology to protect the identities?
So, um, it is so every piece of the information is secure in the clinical setting. If we introduce a step of password protection, and I may not be understanding your question correctly, you don't want to introduce more steps into the clinical setting, right? Because you will slow the radiologist down and the technician down. So the moment they sit, so for example, the moment the technologist comes to that workstation, you know exactly who is there. So we know exactly who has touched that patient information. So because it's a facial image, it makes us a little uncomfortable, but it's just the same in terms of where it sits. It's the same thing as any of your labs, your height, your weight, but it is a person's face, and we're hearing a lot about AI and how AI can flag people unnecessarily. So we are very aware and mindful because early on this was a concern.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to close the session. Thank you so much for